All right, going to finish up the book of Nehemiah tonight. Lord willing, look at chapter 13. After that, we have one more prophet left. That's Malachi. And so we'll try to cover him next week. And I hope this study has at least been a little bit beneficial to you. I know sometimes, we've studied these kings and these prophets together. And I know sometimes that it gets kind of monotonous, because it seems like a lot of these prophets basically have the same message. And if it's the first time you've ever studied, it's probably really overwhelming because you got so many names and dates. But to me, when you study it this way, it sure helps put the Old Testament in kind of a chronological order where you can better understand some of the people and the events and, how they work together and coincide with one another. So after we do chapter 13 tonight, and then we'll do Malachi, we get to go back to Genesis. So not go all the way back. We're going to start with Joseph, and I think we got some Daniel in there. Will might want to teach Daniel. He taught it back there in the back. I heard he did a really, really good job on it, but he said he doesn't want to teach it out here. So, but we'll move on from there and start going back. Then we'll have those section on Jesus and Adam and a lot in that first section there. But anyway, let's cover tonight chapter 13. We don't really have a think about it or discussion question like usual. I couldn't come up with a good one for this one, so I thought, well, sometimes you just do things out of the ordinary and you surprise people. So that's what we've done with tonight. But as you read through, hopefully you've had time to read through chapter 13, or you can at least skim through it while we're covering some of these questions. We'll talk just a little bit more about Nehemiah. If you notice at the top of the page, it's entitled Later Reforms. We studied some of the reformation that Nehemiah made when he immediately arrived in the city of Jerusalem. And these are, or at least some of the events that we're going to read about here in chapter 13, actually occurred sometime later, as we're going to read and figure out in this timeline here. So question number one here, what did the Israelites discover? They're once again reading the book of Moses, reading the law as they are celebrating.
Well, they discovered how far off they were.
Okay. Yeah, and particularly when you read verses 1 and 2 there in chapter 13, what were they so far off on?
They're not supposed to have the Ammonites and Moabites involved.
Yeah. And, most likely, we kind of studied about how Ezra and Nehemiah, are kind of working together throughout this time period. Imagine Ezra is the one reading the law. That was kind of his custom. That's why he went back to Jerusalem and reestablished and rebuilt the law, or reestablished the law there with the Jews. But as they're reading through some of this, the book of Moses is, what's that? Anybody see the book of Moses in their Bible?
I'll be the first four.
Yeah, first five, right? First five books of the Old Testament written by Moses. So we have this reference to the book of Moses. That's what it's talking about. These books that we know as Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But that was called the book of Moses to them. So that's what they're reading from. Real exciting stuff, right? But it's God's commandments and laws for them in that particular day and age. But they came to the passage and they read the stipulation that no Ammonite or Moabite was to be allowed in the tabernacle. This time it would be the temple. But in the beginning it would have been the tabernacle. So the question becomes this: why did God make this law and give it to the Jews that no Moabite, no Ammonite could come into the tabernacle or the temple?
Well, they hadn't helped Israel any, because they didn't offer what? Bread and water and that kind of stuff. And also, that they hired what? Balaam?
Yeah.
To work against them?
Exactly. Remember when God brings Israel up out of the land of Egypt, these are two of the nations that are collaborating together, and they're going to try to destroy Israel before they ever get to the promised land. So you read about a guy by the name of Balaam. Does everybody remember the story of the false prophet Balaam? That's reassuring.
Wasn't he the one that didn't do, or he changed? He was supposed to be against them, but then he.
Yeah, they hired him to curse, put a curse on Israel, didn't they? And every time he went, he blessed them instead. So what did he finally do? Do you remember?
He told them how to cause problems.
Yeah. He came up with this idea or this plan. He said, listen, we're not going to, if God is for these people, we're not going to be able to defeat them. The only way you're going to get them get them destroyed is get their God mad out. And so remember that the Moabite women tried to seduce the men of Israel, invited them to the religious feast, partaking in their idolatry and their immoral activities. And God did destroy 24,000 of them through a plague. But they were the ones who had hired Balaam to try to wipe out, get God mad at Israel and wipe them out. And so God made this law, and the law was simply this: no Ammonite, no Moabite could come into the tabernacle or the temple. So as they're reading through this, they obviously discover we're doing some things wrong here. We got Ammonites and we got Moabites, and they're in the temple area. And so question number 2 here, what did they do in response when they discover this?
Separated from Israel.
Yeah, so when they heard this law or commandment read from God's word, and this is again one of those things as you read through the book of Nehemiah, one of the commendable things about this group of people is it seems like when they figure out they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, that they want to change it. And so they immediately begin to take action, and they say, we gotta clean this up. We got to keep this law that God has given to us. So they made the decision to keep God's law, to separate themselves from the foreigners of the congregation. What did that mean for the Ammonites and the Moabites? How did they separate themselves from them?
They excluded them from the land.
They kicked them out of the temple, didn't they? I mean, that was what God's law said. And so they were forbidden to come into the temple area, and so in order to separate from them, they had to kick them out of the temple area. And sometimes people read these things in the Bible, and they talk about things like racism or discrimination, but this didn't have anything to do with race or discrimination. It was all spiritual, and it was a spiritual commandment that God had given to them. God can lay down the law in any way that he sees fit. There is a reason why God wanted them excluded from the temple and the tabernacle worship. And so it was a spiritual action that they were performing, and they were doing it because of a spiritual doctrine. But they are commendable in the fact that they were the type of people who, a lot of times when they were confronted with something they were doing wrong, they wanted to change it. So here's question number 3. Here's kind of an interesting thing. I mentioned the title of your paper here is Later Reforms. What do we learn about the timeline or the time frame of this chapter as you go down, especially verse 6 there of chapter 13?
Here it was that Artaxerxes was king, or he's still king, I guess.
Yeah. And what do we learn about Nehemiah?
He wasn't in Jerusalem.
Yeah, well, in fact, it says in verse 6 there, during all this, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king. So you have this, kind of a date that's assigned to what's going on here. And here's why this is pretty interesting. If you go back to Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 14, it says about Nehemiah here, it says, "Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions." So remember, whenever we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah coming back, we kind of talked about the time frame that separated them. But what we learn in verse 14 is Nehemiah came in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. And he was governor for 12 years. And what happened in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes? What did we read over there in chapter 13?
He returned back.
Yeah, he went back, didn't he? What was Nehemiah's job? Do you remember? He had a position in the Persian Empire.
Wine taster? Or...
Yeah, cupbearer. His job was to taste all the drink of the king, make sure, and the food of the king, make sure nobody had poisoned it, right? King let him go back to Jerusalem. But Nehemiah had told him, I'll come back when I get everything straightened up. And what we learn about that is 12 years later, he goes back to Persia. But we also learned in chapter 13 and verse 6, did he stay in Persia? No. I don't know how long he went back in Persia. He doesn't say, but he said after certain days, then I got permission from the king to leave, and then I went back to Jerusalem. And so that's kind of the time frame that we're reading about here in this 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. He goes back, he stays in Persia for a while. Some people think he was there 1 to 2 years. I don't know. He just doesn't give us a real definite timeline. I know he was there for some time, but then again, the king gave him permission to go to Jerusalem, and so he returns and goes back to Jerusalem. So if you understand that, what we're going to read about here in the rest of the chapter is going to make a little bit more sense as to why and how these things could have happened and take place. You think about, well, again, hopefully you've had time to at least scan the chapter. What is Nehemiah, whenever he comes back, what is Jerusalem like?
You talking about the first trip back or the second? The first trip or the second?
The second one here in chapter 13. He says he went to King Artaxerxes. He wasn't in Jerusalem. He got permission to go back, and he goes back.
Slipped back in their evil ways again.
Yeah. So what he discovered was, all these fires that were burning, all these spiritual fires that were burning, all this devotion that all the people had pledged and really had started down the right road, they weren't living up to. They weren't living up. Remember, we talked about or read about and studied about the vows that they'd made to God, the covenant that they'd made with God, the agreement that they signed their names to. They weren't living up to those vows. And so what Nehemiah does when he goes back is he immediately takes action. Now, some people have said, well, how in the world, if we're talking about a short amount of time, how in the world could the people go from, just be totally devoted to turning away from everything that they'd started to do? But I want you to think about Moses when he went up on Mount Sinai. How long did it take the children of Israel to turn away from God? After he brought them up out of Egypt, showed them all the plague, divided the Red Sea, walked across on dry land. How long did it take them?
Less than 40 days.
Less than 40 days. Yeah. These people, they were up and down, weren't they? And I kind of think about them, well, at least some of them, they were either hot or cold, like Jesus said, be hot or be cold. And it seems like one day they were hot, and the next day they were cold. And they had, by the time Nehemiah comes back, and remember, it was at least 4 months, or it took Nehemiah 4 months. Was it Nehemiah or Ezra, that we read about? One of those two, it took 4 months to get from Persia to Jerusalem. So just to go back to Persia, you got 4 months just to go back from Persia to Jerusalem, he got 4 more months. That's at least 8 months. And I don't know how long he was there in Persia. But when he gets back, he sees that all these great things that had begun, had fallen back down the hill. And so he immediately says, we got to do something about this. We got to take action. Here's one of the strange things that he finds. Question number 4 here. While Nehemiah was away in Persia, what special favor had Eliashib shown to Tobiah?
And then you move back in.
Yeah, Tobiah had his own room in the temple. And I don't know if it was just a storage room, or some people think that he was actually living there, living in the temple of God. There was a room there, though, that we read about. That room was supposed to be dedicated to God for the storing of the offerings. All these offerings, these tithes and these grain offerings were to be put in the storeroom, so when the Levites needed them, they could go to the storerooms, they could access that and get what they needed. Well, they cleaned one of these storerooms completely out, and they gave it to Tobiah. Said, here you go, do whatever you want with it. So, again, I don't know if he was just storing stuff there, or if he was actually living there in his off time, or what the deal was. But the problem with that is what? Yeah, he was one of those people that wasn't supposed to be in the temple, right? And not only that, but, as you go on here, and this kind of includes question number 5 here, what type of person was Tobiah?
He caused all the problem from the jump go when they tried to build the wall, and he wrote letters to the king and said they were trying to rebel against him. And
Yeah, I mean, remember we've gone through Nehemiah here, and we've read about all this opposition that Nehemiah faces as he begins trying to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And Tobiah is in the forefront of those who are adamantly opposed to the Jews coming back and any rebuilding taking place in Jerusalem. And like Steve said, he did everything within his power. One of the accusations that was made, Tobiah said, what are you guys trying to do? Rebel against the king? He was one of those guys. Remember when they were building the wall, there were people making fun of him. He was one of those guys who said, you don't need an army to knock that wall down. All you need is a fox to walk on top of it, and it'd crumble under its weight. He's a guy that has been against Israel this entire time, and he was furious whenever the walls were completed. So the question becomes this: how does a guy like that wind up living in the temple of God in Jerusalem?
Look at politics today.
Well, one of the things we've learned as we've gone through Nehemiah here is there were still a lot of people who were loyal to outsiders, weren't they? They had formed covenants and relationships with them, and so their loyalty really wasn't to their own nation and to Jerusalem first and foremost, but it was to those who they already had these contracts and these relationships with. But you think about, here's a couple of interesting things here. Turn back to Nehemiah chapter 3 and verse 20. So we read that Eliashib was the one who gave Tobiah this room in the temple, this storage room in the temple. What do we learn about Eliashib in Nehemiah 3 and verse 20 there? Who was he?
The high priest.
He was the high priest. So the high priest was the dude who gave Tobiah a storage room in the temple. Now, here's another little tidbit that we're given in Nehemiah. Turn back to chapter 13 here and go down to verse 28. And what do we learn about Eliashib here? Nehemiah 13 and verse 28.
He was the son-in-law of Sanballat.
Yeah. The son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat. So we read that he had married the high priest's son had married Sanballat's daughter. Now, Sanballat was one of those guys who was like this with Tobiah. You remember that? I mean, so they're bound by family, and this was pretty common in that day and age. A lot of these marriages took place to fortify contracts or relationships. That's why when you read about these kings, they married so many women. I mean, if they formed an alliance with another nation, well, they would marry the king's daughter, and then that kind of cemented that relationship, kind of guaranteed. But before Ezra or Nehemiah show up on the scene, or this may even taken place after, I don't know. We'll talk a little bit about it if we don't run out of time. But remember that Sanballat and Tobiah and these other guys were basically the rulers of that area. So if you married into their family, you had a pretty good standing in that area. And it seems like that's what motivated a lot of these people. High priest's son married Sanballat's daughter. So Sanballat was best friends with Tobiah. So that might tell you a little bit how Tobiah got to be there in the temple through Eliashib. But at any rate, I mean, it was messed up, wasn't it? It was something that should have never, ever happened. Question number 6 here. So how does Nehemiah react whenever he figures out that Eliashib here has given Tobiah this room? Kicked him out, yeah. And this is probably why it's important to understand that Nehemiah was away from Jerusalem for a time. You ask yourself the question, how could this happen? Well, if Nehemiah is out of the picture, then this high priest is going to have a little bit more power in it. And so evidently some of these things that happened were while Nehemiah was gone to Persia, and when he comes back from Persia to Jerusalem, he figures out, well, this is what's been going on while I was gone. And so Nehemiah does not react favorably, right? After he discovers that, first of all, one of Israel's greatest enemies is living in God's temple, right there in the heart of Jerusalem. Secondly, he's an Ammonite, right? Who's not supposed to be in the temple. It's defiled the temple of God. Then he all at once, he threw everything that Tobiah had out of the storage room. And he brought everything, well, they cleansed the room, they purified it, and then all the items that had been removed that were supposed to be there in service to the temple of God, they were restored to their rightful place. We also read about another situation here, the Levites and the singers. What had happened to them? Question number 7. Yeah, and this may be one of those things, we just read about this storeroom, all these things being brought back in. It may have been in the process of bringing these things back in the storeroom that Nehemiah discovers, we don't have all the stuff that's supposed to be here. There should be a lot of stuff. There should be a lot of tithes. There should be a lot of offerings to be put back into this storeroom. Maybe he discovers there's not enough. And so he also, in this process, discovers that the Levites and the singers, remember all those people that had been brought to the city of Jerusalem to live there and to set up Jerusalem as kind of this religious center for Israel, they all had to go back home. And the people, they had to go back home because the people had stopped tithing and they'd stopped offering and giving like they said they were going to do. You remember when we read in chapter 10, the covenant that they made? Remember all the stuff they said they were going to do? They said, we're going to give the tithes, we're going to pay the temple tax like we're supposed to. We're going to give the first fruits of all the offerings, all the grain, all the animals. Well, the last thing you read about, I think there in chapter 10, let me look real quickly, make sure I'm not saying something that is not true. But if you look in verse 39, the last thing that they say is, we will not neglect the house of our God. That was the covenant, part of the covenant that they made and signed their names to. But Nehemiah gets back here, and again, think about this. These people who work in and around the temple, we're not talking about 3 people. We're talking about thousands of people that worked in and around the temple, and they depended on these offerings in order to survive. I mean, that was their income. They got a portion of these offerings. They didn't get it all, but they did get a portion of it, and that portion was put back in these storehouses, and then whenever they needed something, they would go to the storehouse and they would get food or get money out of those storehouses. So when Nehemiah returns, he discovers the people had failed to keep their promise, and so the Levites had no support. Nothing was being brought in, and so they were forced to desert the temple. They had to go back to living off the land in order to just survive. And that's, the Levites is one of those things that as you go through the Old Testament, God was very specific and very careful to warn Israel time and time again to take care of the Levites, not forsake them, because they didn't get it. All these people had all this land and all these possessions, but the Levites didn't have all those things. And so it was rough for them. If they didn't get supported through the temple offerings, it was rough for them to even, make a living and survive in that day and age. So question number 8 here, why does Nehemiah rebuke the officials?
He was holding the priest accountable of what happened there.
Yeah, well, again, they've broken their vows, and they've broken their covenant that they made to God, and Nehemiah comes to these guys are the leaders, right? These are the guys that are supposed to be holding all this together. Nehemiah shows up, and he gets everything going, spends 12 years working there and getting everything established, and he leaves, and then this leadership just, falls off the cliff. So Nehemiah said, you guys haven't been doing your job. You made this vow, you made this covenant, you made this promise to God, but you've not been keeping it. And so they failed in their duties, allowed things to fall apart. How important is good leadership? It's essential. That's right. Without it, nothing is, you're not going to be successful without it. So what does Nehemiah do? He removes those men who were in charge of the storehouses, and he appoints new ones. Question number 9 here, how does he choose the men to be put in charge of the storehouses?
Mainly for the ones that were counted faithful.
Yeah. He looked for faithful men. And if you read through that list, he kind of covers the whole group of people too. Some were priests, some were Levites, some were just commoners that were appointed over these storehouses, but they all had at least one thing in common, and that was they were faithful to the Lord. And so Nehemiah knew that they'd do what they were supposed to do with those storehouses, not let Tobiah come in and live in one of them. But he appointed faithful men over those storehouses. Let's see here. We're running out of time. We're going to speed it up a little bit. 2 main sins, question 11 here. 2 main sins that the people of Israel were guilty of. What were they? That's mentioned here in chapter 13. Violating the Sabbath day. What was the second one?
Marrying the other, what's it called?
Yeah, they were intermarrying.
But they were intermarrying, and their children weren't speaking the right languages.
Yeah, they were intermarrying with those nations that God told them don't intermarry with these people because of their background, because of their idolatrous background. He said, you intermarry with these people, and they're going to lead you down the wrong road. They're going to lead you into idolatry. And so he established them not to do that. Those 2 were the 2 main sins that Nehemiah had to deal with. So what action, question 12 here, what actions does Nehemiah take to ensure that Israel is going to keep the Sabbath holy? Sabbath was the 7th day, right? What was special about that day in the Old Testament? It was a day of rest, right? No work, was to be done. It was a day of reflection, remembering they were slaves in Egypt, for 400 years. God brought them out and gave them a day of rest to remind them that he brought them out of that slavery. So what does he do to help ensure that they're going to keep the Sabbath day holy?
Shut the gate and didn't open it until after it was over.
Yeah. A couple of, I got 3 things that I wrote down here. And again, this goes back, why were the people doing what they were doing on the Sabbath day? They were greedy. Okay? That's the bottom line of it. They wanted another day of business. They wanted another day where they could gain more money. They wanted another day where they could get good deals. And so they worked on the Sabbath day.
The rule for violating Sabbath was to be stoned.
Yeah.
And, that seems like a kind of risky business, but I guess it's what they want doing in the law anyway, but that seems like a big no-no.
Yeah. Well, I ain't got time to go into that, but yeah, it was an important commandment, wasn't it? You can tell by the penalty that was attached to it. But of course, Nehemiah, the first thing he does, he rebukes them, tells them to stop. You're violating the Sabbath day. Goes to the nobles, to those leaders in charge, and says, why are you letting this happen? You guys are in charge here. And then the third thing he did is he ordered the city gate to be shut on the Sabbath day. And it kind of seems like maybe the guards of that gate were being bribed by some of these Gentiles to open the gate on the Sabbath day to them, and they were letting them in. So Nehemiah appoints his own personal servants to be the gatekeepers on the Sabbath day. And so he's doing these things to make sure that, no business is going to be conducted on that day. Did that stop those Gentile merchants from coming?
Not first.
No. First Sabbath day, they're camped outside the gate. And I think they were hoping, well, maybe if we set up out here, the people will come out to us. We don't have to go in. But of course, Nehemiah threatened them, and he said, you guys keep on doing that, you're going to be arrested. And so that finally made them go away, didn't it? Let's see here. So how does Nehemiah react to the Israel sin of intermarriage with foreigners? Question 14 there.
Well, he contended with them, and he cursed them, and he smoked some of them.
Yeah. Remember the authority that was given to these men who came back from the king, both Nehemiah and Ezra? I mean, they were basically given the authority they could confiscate your land. They could put you in prison, right? If the offense was serious enough, they could put you to death, couldn't they? And so this tells you a little bit about Nehemiah's feelings about them violating this law. And here's part of the problem that was ended up, I think somebody mentioned it, but half of the children couldn't even speak Hebrew. Right? Why was that important? What was the law of Moses written in? If you didn't know Hebrew, you couldn't read the law of God. And you couldn't understand it if somebody read it to you. And so that's, you think about that, you're going to raise a generation that can't read God's law and can't understand it if somebody reads it to them. I mean, what's that going to do to Israel? Not going to be good, is it? But besides that, they were not supposed to have these relationships anyway. And so Nehemiah rebukes the guilty parties. He calls down curses upon them. Remember when we studied about them making a covenant with God, one of the things that they agreed to were the curses of the law. Do you remember that? That meant whatever the law said should happen to them, they said, we agree. If we break this law, then this is what we want to happen to us. And so you read about, he had some of them beaten, their hair, some versions say pull out, some say shaven, but that was a sign of disgrace. And Nehemiah, he punished those people who had broken this law, and then he challenged them to renew their oaths to God. He gave them a sermon too, didn't he? What was his sermon to them about? when it came to these mixed marriages?
I guess he used Solomon's
Yeah.
as an example of that God loved him, but he did outlandish things.
Solomon and his mixed marriages, right? What did those mixed marriages lead him to do?
Sin.
Led him to sin, led him to worship idols. And there were some people that would not change what happened to them. Matter of fact, Elisha's son is one of those things one of those people we read about there. Yeah, they were exiled, weren't they? They were thrown out of Jerusalem and then basically exiled from the Jewish nation. So, all right, that's the book of Nehemiah. Anybody got any comments or questions about it or chapter 13? Lord willing, next week, if you've got some time, read the book of Malachi, and then we'll talk a little bit about Malachi and his message. Hopefully you'll see how his message fits in with chapter 13 here, because that would have been a time frame that he prophesied in. So, all right.
How could they tell who was who? Were they visually, like, oh, these are Ammonites or whatever? How can you tell?
One of the things that we read about when they returned was the official registry. And so they had an official list of those who were Jews. And remember, if their names were not even found on there, they weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem or in the nation. And so the only thing that I can think of is, they're going to have that verifiable evidence, those records that would prove their ancestry, of being that of the Jew. So if your name wasn't there, you weren't a Jew, basically. But yeah, that's one of them tough things that we read about. We read about their zeal to do what God said, but that'd be a tough thing to do, wouldn't it? Think about those relationships and those children, obviously people that they love, but it's God's law, and that's what He wants from us. Wants complete obedience. So, anybody else?
They call them passports.
Do what?
They call them passports, right?
Call them what? It's a joke, but I can't understand it.
The same things that are going on.
Oh,
And they're having, hardliner, that's what.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we read about these people, but have you ever had to renew your covenant with God? Anybody ever had that experience before? Renew your covenant with God? We all made a covenant when we obeyed the gospel, right? You ever had to renew your covenant with God, part of it? I think all of us have. But that's kind of human nature, isn't it? We struggle.